Hey, I will call this committee of the whole meeting from Monday, July 15th, 2024 to order, and start by acknowledging with gratitude that we live and work on the traditional unceded territory of the Squamish Nation, whose people have been stewards of these lands and waters surrounding Metlelawem, Bowen Island. So welcome to our committee of the whole meeting. The first item on our agenda is approval of the agenda. To our corporate officer for the introduction of any late items.
No late items.
Yep. With that, I will look for a motion to adopt the agenda for our meeting today, moved by Councillor Saunders, seconded by Councillor Wake. Discussion, changes, amendments to the agenda. Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor, raise your hand, say aye. Aye. That carries unanimously. Moving on to section 3.1 bylaws, bylaw amendments for short-term rental. We have our manager of planning and development joining us here today. I feel like, because we're more of an informal meeting, like every time a staff member comes and joins us at a table, we need like theme music for them. Right? Like a boxing ring or like a wrestling match. Over to you, Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Mayor Leonard. So I have before you a report on a series of bylaw amendments to do with short-term rentals on Bowen Island. Just by way of background, on March 25th, Council made a resolution to write to the Ministry of Housing requesting to opt into the principal residence requirement in Bill 35 and directed staff to amend the land use bylaw, business license bylaw, and bylaw notice enforcement bylaw to include a principal residence requirement for the residential guest accommodation use. So I have the three bylaws here for your discussion. So bylaw 658 is a bylaw that would amend the business license bylaw. And it would do a number of things. It would include some of the definitions from that provincial act around principal resident. It would place requirements on bed and breakfast use to mirror RGA use. So that's things like requirements when it comes to applications for new businesses. So with insurance and designated contact individual, notice to adjacent neighbors, things like that. It would include the principal residence requirement to match provincial principal residence requirement, and it would include applications fees for business licenses. So one of the things that we've encountered since business licenses were adopted, we've never increased the business license fees. And sort of what we find is that doing the initial application process is actually the most heavily involved process, especially for short-term rentals. They're quite labor intensive, partly working with applicants and partly working through all the various requirements. And so what we're proposing in this bylaw would be an application fee for business license requirements for new businesses. And then when you have a license, you would pay the annual fee that you do now. That wouldn't change, but this application fee would be a cost. Additionally, it would capture things like when people apply and staff, review their business license and do all the work of that. And then they say, oh, I just changed my mind. I'm not doing it. I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm not going to bother. And then staff has spent that time doing the work. We've actually got a fee out of it. Bylaw 659 is the least exciting bylaw. It's the bylaw notice enforcement bylaw, so that's penalties. And so what it does, one of the changes we're making is increasing the penalty for operating a business without a license and trying to make it so that in every case, the first offense is equal to the license fee. So if the annual license fee of $150, then the penalty for operating without a license for the first offense is $150. And then what it does is any further offenses just become the maximum permitted, which is $500. Or I think it ends up being $450, and then if you're late, it's $500 or it's something like that. But essentially, you're just trying to simplify it. So in every case, operating a business without a business license, the first offense is equal to the license fee, and further offenses with the maximum penalty. And then bylaw 660 amends the land use bylaw. So similar to the business license bylaw, it would include definitions for terms in Bill 35, like property host and principal residence requirement. It would amend the RGA definition to include reference to the principal residence. It would amend the B&B regulations to specify that the resident operating a bed and breakfast must be using the property as their principal residence. So currently our land use bylaw requires for a bed and breakfast that you be a resident of the dwelling on the lot. And so this would amend it, so it has to be your principal residence. And then requiring an RGA be operated in the property host's principal residence and or an accessory residential unit on the same property. So again, to mirror those requirements in both 35. And then what I've just pulled together here is just some examples of what the impacts would be on different short-term rental cases on Darwin. And I've just pulled from some example businesses for the different uses based on their sort of online postings and business license information. So for a residential guest accommodation use, this is, an example that's fairly typical. It's a detached dwelling on a property. In this example, the zone is in the SR2 zone and its business license category is RGA. So in these proposed bylaws, what would change is this principal residence requirement for the RGA. So the operator of the RGA would have to live on the property as their principal resident. And that's the same change that happens in this case for the decision to opt into Bill 35. Again, it would have to comply with the province's principal residence requirement. Another example, so Petoki Inn is a bed and breakfast on Bowen. It's in this case, in the settlement residential 1A zone, and its business license category is bed and breakfast. So bed and breakfasts in our proposed bylaws would have a number of changes so that the principal residence requirements for B&Bs would be in effect in our bylaws and in the province's Bill 35. And that an operator this would have to be their principal residence as opposed to just being a resident of the dwelling on the lot. And there'd be increased license requirements for bed and breakfast. So they'd be required to advertise their license number, they would need to provide proof of insurance and contact for designated individuals. That's it. Another example, another category type we have, retreat center use is a use in our land use bylaw. So an example of that is Nectar Yoga in the middle of the island. It is zoned retreat center 2 and its business license category is commercial. In this case, none of the proposed bylaws would affect the retreat center use. I mean, I guess with the exception of potentially the bylaw notice enforcement for non-compliance, but I haven't really included that, assuming that businesses are operating according to our bylaw. And there'd be no changes to the opt-in to Bill 35 as a commercial property. Next one being commercial guest accommodation use. So i.e. the Union Steamship Marina operates in the village commercial zone as a commercial business license. None of our proposed bylaws would change the commercial guest accommodation use. And then so the one sort of question mark we still have is in terms of opt-in to Bill 35, the VIM staff, believe underneath the province's principal residence requirement does not apply to this commercial use, but we haven't received that confirmation from the province. And then finally, we have a use in our land use bylaw called the guest house use. An example of a business in this zone is Artisan Suites and Artisan Square. It's operating under that zoning. So in this example, it's in the CB1 zone. Its business license category is commercial. And again, there's no changes to the proposed bylaws that are before you for this guest house use, and the province's principal residence requirement would not apply to the commercial use. And so this was the recommendation from the council meeting, and so we'd be looking for a recommendation to from the committee of the whole to refer this to regular council meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. I'll look to council for questions, comments, clarifications. Councilor Morse.
I've got a number of typo things which I just run over quickly with Danielle and we'll run over again. So just for clarity on the bed and breakfast, because I don't think any of us twigged back in the beginning when we did the opting in that this applied to bed and breakfast. Because I think we all thought short-term rentals was a whole house, and all the submissions we got from people only related to people that were renting whole suites or whole houses with kitchens and full meal deal. So anyhow, so the number of bedrooms is okay. if somebody's got 5 bedrooms in their house, they don't have to be reclassified as a guest house to operate it as a B and B.
The land use bylaw permits 4 or 5 guest bedrooms, depending on the size of the property, but these bylaws wouldn't change that number.
Okay, and the provincial thing about operating a B and B in a suite in your house,
It permits multiple bedrooms.
it does permit multiple bedrooms, because I was having trouble tracking all that through.
Yeah.
So nothing's really gonna change for the B and B people, except it's gotta be your principal residence.
Correct. That would be the changes that currently our land use bylaw requires that it be operated by a resident of the dwelling on the lot. And so now the requirement is that, it's your principal residence as opposed to just you are a resident. So I guess there's some avenue there where maybe somebody resides on their Bowen house for 5 months of the year, and when they're residing on Bowen, they're operating a bed and breakfast. And in that case, then they wouldn't be able to continue operating unless it was their principal residence.
And then I'm still concerned about the commercial guest accommodation. Because it's quite, reading the definition of what is a short-term rental. It clearly picks up all those cottages in Griffin Park and the ones that Union Steamships are off.
Yeah, and we're still trying to get clarity from the province on that. I would just say like, these bylaws don't change that in any way.
So we're hoping that the province will go along with that, but what do we do? They've got the final decision, don't they, for enforcement?
Yes, the province would be enforcing their legislation.
So until we actually maybe have somebody make a complaint to them.
Yeah.
All right. And then I guess my other question is, it's more of a notification side. Notifying neighboring properties on all adjacent sides. If I'm understanding adjacent, from what you said, it's either side, not across the street.
Yeah, I'm gonna check with, because that's language that's currently in our bylaw just for notifying for RGAs. And this would expand it to be giving that notice for B and Bs as well. And I would have to check with our business license inspector. Sort of how broadly you've been operating that.
Yeah.
It tends to be our preferences like to be like more inclusive. It's kind of like, does it hurt if you notify
It
additional?
seems to me the people right across the street and the people on either side of the people right across the street can be just as affected as the
Yeah.
people on either side. Yeah, so. Yeah. Okay. So we could interpret adjacent loosely. To be more neighboring,
Yeah,
or do we want a circle, I guess, or something? Within 100 meters or something like that, like we used for other ones.
Thank you, Councilor Morris. Councilor Getty?
So, two questions, I guess. If we kept it similar to, adjacent does mean on either side. The dictionary definition, so if we wanted to change it so that it's within 100 meters or whatever we normally do for elements and bylaws and things, so that we inconsistent in any way?
I guess I'd say like operationally expanding it to 100 meters, like is a fairly. Depending on the property, is a fair bit more like notice and more work that we're doing. Like typically this is to notify people with like potential invasive issues.
Is that sending out a letter?
Yes.
And if we get these questions back from the province that are not in favor of the guest accommodation and the other, then do we need to revise these bylaws? If we want to allow them? Or does the province say, no, you can't do that anymore, it has to be principal residence?
Yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah, that's, for the Union Steamship is really the one that's at question. And I remember trying to look into it as well back in March and figure out, because our zoning would permit, to be operated more as a hotel. And so that seems to me possibly the avenue is that, you know, is that it might be just how it's operated. So like the artisan suites example, seems like it's operated more as a hotel than as like cabins for rent. So it's possible that like the answer may be that they have to restructure how it's operated more than the zoning, because the zoning seems like it could operate either way. Or the other option, I guess, would be maybe if the zoning removed the option for dwelling in that zone. I don't know if that's something, you know, I don't know if that's a route that the Union Steamship would want to go down. But it seems like that would be their approach, to say, well, dwellings aren't permit, you know, there can't be a permanent resident in this zone. Would be an avenue as well to say that this commercial use is what is the intended use of the property. But I think without like clarity from the province, I don't think I could recommend like an avenue. I just know that these three bylaws that are before you essentially don't touch that issue of commercial guest accommodation use.
Yes.
I just wanted to touch on the notice requirements, and so just for examples, like in Deep Bay, if we changed it to 100 meters,
A lot.
you would go from having to have notified 2 to 4 to having to notify probably the whole neighborhood. So everybody in the area, so that would be dozens. And there are other neighborhoods with that high density, which really change things. And then perhaps in areas where there's larger lots with a 100-meter distance. Well, I guess no. Probably. I was thinking you may not hit anybody, but
Just immediate.
Larger lots probably also might not have any impact on adjacent neighbors if it's a 10-acre lot. If it's a 10-acre lot, you know, the adjacent neighbors might not be anywhere near or even, you know, hear anything.
I know that, so looking at like the local government act requirement for board of variance requires notification to land adjacent to land. And we go stricter than that, and we say 100 meters for a board of variance application, but even before that, we would commonly notify people across the street, like, that was assumed that was who, you know, that was included in that circle of notification. When you don't kind of, you know, when providing notice, we're essentially providing notice so that people are aware that it's up and are aware of like essentially the contact number to complain or like send those complaints and, you know, have an avenue to people stop operating in a way that disturbs them. But we're not really giving people, we're not looking for comments for people to say like, I don't think you should do this. Like, well, no, you're allowed to do it. We're just notifying you so that you can complain, you know.
It's almost a 6-1 way, half a dozen the other sort of the philosophy. Go, you know, I know from living in Deep Bay, previously, for example, there parents were away and teenagers would have a house party. That affects the entire, you know, exactly. Yeah, Judy used to be my neighbor, but it would affect the whole neighborhood versus what Councilor Morris is talking about, a 10-acre lot. It's just not going to carry nearly as far.
Luckily, they've all graduated from high school.
Okay, and then so the second concern with properties like the Union Steamship that are possibly in a gray area, it does sound like there are remedies that we could take should the province come back and say that this doesn't quite fit, because I would imagine, you know, that's not the only property in the province that rents out cabins.
I'm thinking there's got to be several in the various islands that
Yeah.
I think I've stated some.
Does it get complicated in terms of either of them are leased from Crippen or from Methil?
At least they manage them.
Yeah, but they don't hold them.
They have a contract.
To manage.
Right,
Oh, interesting.
so. At least by any other name, it's a contract to manage, but nevertheless, does that complicate things?
It would, just because they're probably then two different cases, and if they're in different zones, they're different owners.
Does it make a difference to, if Crippen is the owner and Metro's the owner? So they're not gonna have principal residence.
Yeah,
It's just a separate contract, but it is
yeah.
short-term rental.
Like, I think they're different, like the province could come back with different answers for the different properties.
Yeah, so I mean, just naming the texture of the conversation around the table, it would appear that there's a desire to keep the Union Steamship cottages as they are, that we could look into paths forward in our bylaw and land use bylaw classifications of those properties to ensure that they aren't captured by the provincial regulation. And it sounds like what I'm hearing from the planner is that it's a wait and see until that happens, or until the province gets into some clarity on those edge cases.
Yeah, I know my sense from the province communication we've had, even asking like, every time after March, is that they were heavily focused on the lead into like May 1st requirement for most of the province and most of the cases. And they've sort of been like, well, you're not till November, like,
There's got to be other similar situations.
yeah, and so that's kind of my hope too, is even by the fall, maybe they'll be able to say, well, here, now we've got experience and all the places that came into effect May 1st. We've got like a slate of options of how things work. Seemed like this type of category.
Councilor Getty.
It's not a bad idea for any of these places to have the contact person and, to make sure that there's adequate insurance. In terms of, in Davy's Orchard, we had promises that there wouldn't be, rentals to stag parties and things like that, and that never actually happened. And that's when there was damage and there was no recourse. So it's not a bad thing to have these kinds of prescriptions on all of short-term rentals, so that if there's a problem, you can contact somebody.
Right.
But there is a residence in above the whatever that tuck shop is. See how that goes.
Okay, seeing no further discussion, I'll look for someone to move the recommendation, please. That's right. So moved by Councilor Wake. Seconded by Councilor Getty. Any further discussion, debate? Councilor Saunders.
In the absence of anyone talking me out of this line of thought. As you may recall, I was against us opting in at the time, primarily because I thought we should sit and wait, but that ship sailed and I get that, and I have no particular issue with the bylaw changes or the wording of them or the desire to make those changes. But just in the interests of intellectual consistency, I feel like I can't support the change, at least at first reading, simply to be consistent with my previous thought.
Stuck with a problem, and this is.
Yeah.
That's fine, I'm gonna support it, and I was with you in opposing it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, Councilor Getty.
Procedurally, can we do this at a committee of the whole meeting?
This is just sending this committee of the whole sends the recommendation to council.
Can I just ask one more? In your report to council, when you go back, can you make it clear that it's not effective until November 1st? Just because.
Yes, I mean, I'll say, I think probably assuming that this motion happens from the committee, we'd be looking to come back to the July 22nd meeting, I think, for first reading, so we can trigger the Islands Trust referral. So I can then come back in September, just now track to be adopted before, but yes, I've been trying to make that.
Yeah, just add not effective until November 1st to the last paragraph on your background.
So seeing no further discussion or debate, I'll call the question. All in favor, raise your hand, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, Councilor Saunders. So motion carries with Councilor Saunders in opposition. Thank you, Mr. Martin. Moving on to new business 4.1. Can I have a motion? Someone move the recommendation to move to a closed committee of the whole. By Councilor Getty. Second by Councilor Wake. All in favor, raise your hand, say aye.
Aye.
That carries unanimously. Last up is a motion to adjourn. By Councilor Getty, second by Councilor Saunders. All in favor, raise your hand, say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries unanimously. We are